Welcome to Reading Rule, y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the rural authors who write it. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I'm excited to talk to you about today's topic at hand. If you're a teacher, student, or community member in a rural community, my hope is that the content here honors you and your experiences by discussing and analyzing books that can serve as a mirror for you. If you're an urban or suburban teacher, student, or community member, this series is for you too, and I hope that it can provide nuance to the stereotypical depictions of rural people so often seen in popular media. So come on in, and let's get to it. Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and today I am so excited to be talking to Kalynn Bayron, the author of Whippoorwill award-winning This Poison Heart and its sequel, This Wicked Fate. Kalynn Bayron is the New York Times and indie best-selling author of the YA fantasy novel Cinderella is Dead and This Poison Heart. Her latest works include the YA fantasy This Wicked Fate and the middle grade paranormal adventure The Vanquishers. I still need to get my hands on a copy of that. She is a Philip Carnegie Medal nominee, a two-time Sybil's Award nominee, and the recipient of the 2022 Randall Keenan Award for Black LGBTQ Fiction. She is a classically trained vocalist and musical theater enthusiast. When she's not writing, you can find her watching scary movies and spending time with her family. Welcome, Kalynn, and I am so excited to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If it's all right, could I ask you a couple of random questions first?
Yeah, go for it.
What is, as a musical theater enthusiast, what is your favorite musical?
Of all time? Oh, man.
Or just like right now. I know that's a hard question, but
it is. It's such a hard question. I would say right now my favorite musical is Hadestown.
okay.
And maybe like of all time, Wicked is up there. The Wiz is also really high up on my list. So yeah, it's so hard to choose.
So even as a rural kid, in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, in my music class, we watched The Wiz probably 6 times. It was like always the movie that was shown on like days where we had a substitute or whatever. And I really loved it. So I was never upset when we had to watch it. There were other kids who were like, this again. I think my favorite would probably be Rent. That's one of my all-time
Yeah, that was one of the very first shows that I ever saw. Yeah.
And then scary movies. What's your favorite?
Ooh, another hard one. I'm gonna say, ooh, so hard. So I think The Shining is one of my favorite movies. I know that the movie gets like a bad rap, just because if you've read the book and whatever, but I love it. I also really love Misery, just as a movie. Stephen King fan, obviously. And I love the Scream movies. I love all of them, every single one of them. So yeah.
We are becoming fast friends because those are all of my favorites too. I mean, they invented a piece of equipment to be able to get this sort of like mood and tone in The Shining. Like they invented like the dolly on rails so that they could get that weird floating feeling, and it had never been used before. I mean, it's a classic. Like you have to love it,
It is. It's a classic for sure.
And then I was like in middle school when the Scream movies came out, and I was super into scary movies at that point in my life, and they were just like, Matthew Lillard in Scream is like one of my favorite things.
Yeah, he's just the best. He's just, I mean, I know he's not like the best in the movie, but like he's the best. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for indulging me in my random questions. My next question is one that actually pertains to this podcast, and it's the one that I ask everyone, and it is, where are you from, and how do you feel like the place that you came from shapes who you are as both a person and a writer?
Yeah, so I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, which is always kind of a topic of conversation when people find out that that's where I'm from, because it's kind of out of the way. And Anchorage is a fairly small place, but it's tied into like the oil industry and the military. So there's people up there for like any number of weird reasons. And it it's one of those places that is so beautiful. It's just in the middle of the summer, the sun doesn't set, and in the middle of the winter, it's like it doesn't come up. It's like these extremes. But it's a beautiful place. Wildlife is great. The scenery is great. Um, I think growing up in Alaska, you feel the world feels very small. If you're just in Anchorage, if you're just in Alaska, you know, in general, you're it feels very small. And so I spent a lot of time kind of by myself, just kind of me and my brother, writing stories. I wrote a lot of songs, a lot of really terrible songs when I was a kid. Um, you know, just trying to figure out what I was going to do and wondering kind of what was beyond the limits of this kind of very small place. And I think I take a lot of that emotion, a lot of that feeling into my writing. That kind of need to think about, you know, what's kind of beyond what you know, and how scary it can feel to go to a new place, to a bigger place. I think I take all of that into my writing. So where I come from hugely influences how I write and what I write about. Um, but yeah, Anchorage is home.
Okay, so that's really interesting, and it sort of is a nice segue into something that I wanted to talk about in terms of this poison heart. Place is my obsession, and especially thinking about where we're from and where we go and whether or not we come back, like all of this movement across places influences the way that we develop our identities, how we navigate the world, how we see the world, how the world sees us. And the thing that was really interesting to me about Bree's experiences in this poison heart is that, you know, she's growing up in the city and there's all this gentrification happening around her, and her mom's rent is going, you know, the rent for the store is going up, like everything. So they're kind of getting priced out of where they're living. And then, you know, this manor, like this mansion in like sort of the middle of nowhere pops up. And so they're thinking about like, do we go, do we not go? And she references quite a few times, like, you know, is this going to be like the movie Get Out? Because if this is going to be the movie Get Out for me, I don't know if I can do this. But so there's this really interesting, tension between like the city is comfort and home and sort of safe, but also unsafe, because her powers are more noticeable in the city, because when the trees bend to her or pay attention to her, it's a lot easier to see because it's a concrete jungle and there are, so, you know what I mean? There's like such little plant life that like when the plant life reacts to her, it's really noticeable. And then there's also, but it's also unsafe because the rent is going up and, you know, they're struggling to figure out how they're going to exist in that place. And so then they go to this more rural place, which allows her sort of space to open up and sort of flex her skills and be herself in a way that she's not been able to previously. And both of her moms are like, you know, this is a place where you can stretch, you know, like this is a place where you can start to figure out like who you are. And so in that way, it's kind of safer for her. But then in other ways, it's unsafer for her because of her intersectional identity as, you know, a Black young woman. And also in like the fact that people are sort of like coming for what exists at the house. Right. And so I just wondered I just found that really fascinating. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts around that and sort of how you were thinking about place when you were writing the book. I just found it a really complex and nuanced way to deal with place in a way that doesn't always happen. You know, like the rural isn't just like hicks and hillbillies, and the city just like cosmopolitan people and, you know, gangs, you know, like there's it's not simple at all. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's something that I thought a lot about, specifically with, you know, this story that centers this queer Black family. And in both settings, right, in this more kind of city setting, and then out, in this small town setting, it's like there are issues in both places. There are challenges to living in both places. Um, but one of my biggest kind of literary influences is Zora Neale Hurston, and in her lifetime, she kind of she took up the task of kind of collecting stories from communities of rural Black people. And in society's eyes, these people, had very little to offer because of their circumstances. They were devalued, they were dehumanized. But Zora Neale Hurston knew better. These were, this was her family. These were people that she grew up with. And she knew that Black people kind of living in these very rural areas, specifically with her in the American South, were worthy of respect. They were her people. And so I was thinking a lot about that when I was writing, because in this small town setting, whether it's in fantasy, other types of fiction, we don't often see Black people, and we even less often see queer Black people in those settings, but we exist there. And so I really wanted to explore that. I really wanted to have kind of this mirror between Bree's life in Brooklyn and her life in Rhinebeck, and what that meant for her, what that meant for her family. And I think it was nice to be able to kind of explore both of those things, and how the challenges that Bree was facing, how that affected her everyday life, and not just this kind of magical power that she has, but also just her the way that she navigates her life on a daily basis. She's, Briseis is in this Poison Heart and in this Wicked Fate. She's in Brooklyn, and there's millions of people, and she's a city girl, and that's okay. And I love that for her. But, I needed to take her and her moms to this smaller place. Rhinebeck is like 8,000 people, maybe. It's because there's value there. There are people whose experiences matter, and whose, there are Black people and other non-Black people of color that live in these places. There are queer people that live in these places. There are people who have intersectional identities that live in these places. And I wanted to highlight that. I wanted to show what that might mean, and have one of these stories. Lots of stories are set in small towns, but again, not so much centering Black people or queer people. So I really wanted to have that small town kind of feel, the kind of mysterious setting. It's like a touristy thing, but then there's this other kind of underlying kind of secret that's running through this small town. That seems like a pretty common storytelling device, but I wanted it to center this queer Black family. And so it was definitely something I was conscious of, and that I was actively exploring while I was writing this Poison Heart and this Wicked Fate.
And I think that shows, like, because all of those things are things that like are extremely important to me, and are things that I look for in every book, be it rural or not, that I read, especially when it comes to place. Like, who are the people who are represented here? Who are the people who actually exist here and are missing? Whose stories are omitted? And what does that mean about sort of like the dominant narratives that society tells about specific places and communities? And how do those need to be disrupted so that people aren't left out and forgotten?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, the rural South is a monolith of white people is just like,
yeah. And this is, I grew up in Anchorage, but my dad's family is from Birmingham, Alabama. And so we spent summers there, and there's, a strong connection to the South with my family. And I just, this kind of idea that Black people in these rural areas are neglected, or that they should be forgotten or cast aside. It's like people are talking about Alabama, people are talking about Mississippi, people are talking about Florida, people are talking about Texas. People are and kind of wanting to excise them. But I'm like, wait a minute, there are people that live in these places who have value, who have who mean something to people. It's like we have to be more conscious of how we portray these places and these people in our popular media, because I think it's doing a huge disservice to people like my family who just trying to make a life, trying to make a living, trying to survive. And those stories are important, and they deserve care and concern just like everything else.
Yeah, because those people are contributors to society just like everyone else, like
Yes.
like rural people in general, especially those who come from resource extraction communities, have sort of like, laid the foundation for this country, whether it was through coal or timber or farming or whatever. Like those things, those people's stories are the backbone of this nation. And so many of them are left out and maligned, really. And it's annoying, to say the
Yeah.
least.
Yes.
Especially because I grew up on a farm. My entire family were farmers and factory workers, and my dad's family is all from East Tennessee, and so we're Appalachian. And the story about Appalachia is, especially as depicted in Deliverance, is not very, you know what I mean, like. And
yeah,
the thing that annoys me too is that rural stereotypes are sort of like still okay. Like you
right.
can make a rural joke, you can make a redneck joke, you can make a, you know what I mean, in like a board meeting, and like nobody, everyone's gonna laugh, ha ha ha, rural people are stupid. But like that's not true. That's not the case. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing here is like trying to disrupt those. And then especially for folks whose intersectional identities don't match with the dominant understanding of rural places as white people who wave bad flags and do bad things.
Right.
And who, like, again, are the foundation of this,
Right.
like, so yeah, so I loved that about This Poison Heart. And I really appreciate that you are, working to tell those stories, because we need those more. I mean, I taught in, a school in Indiana that probably had 450 students, 7 through 12. And I still had Black students, and I had, like Asian American Pacific Islander students, and I had queer students. A lot of them chose not to come out until after they were out of school,
Sure.
which made me sad, but I understood.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's that tension between tradition and distrust of outsiders and distrust of difference, that comes with the way that rural places have been treated. And then how that sort of like works its way into the people and the culture, and then how we sort of have to work together to sort of, not to get too on the nose, but to prune those, from our communities in order to be more inclusive and welcoming. And I wish that I would have had books. I wish I would have known about books like This Poison Heart when I was in the classroom, so that I could make them part of my curriculum and show my students that, like, you can exist as a rural queer Black person, like that, like that existence is something that you can be, and that's something good to be. It's
Yes.
but they just don't, there aren't nearly as many as what I feel like there should be. So I just appreciate you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that my overall kind of goal is just to make sure that we have, I want my work to be in conversation with other stories. I want my work to kind of be another choice for young readers. Here is another story where you might be able to find yourself. That is kind of, my goal. Another book that does that really well is As Brave as You Are by Jason Reynolds. It's another one that kind of comes to mind. It's these, more Brooklyn kind of transplants, but to the Virginia countryside, but still it's kind of like, these stories are here and they exist. And it's really about creating mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors, like Dr. Radine Sims Bishop says, and giving young readers another opportunity to see themselves, especially our young readers whose identities have been excluded and marginalized.
And I love As Brave as You, and one of my biggest frustrations is that it's his least talked about book.
Yeah.
Even though it was also an award winner.
Yes.
And why is it his least talked about book? Probably because it takes place in the country.
Yeah.
You know, and so like that is just supremely annoying to me because it's a great book. It is so good. But yeah, the same with This Poison Heart and This Wicked Fate. Like those are such important stories, and I was so excited to see that This Wicked Fate was on the New York Times bestseller list. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm still in a little bit of shock because of that, but yes.
Yeah. But yeah, so we need more books that and it's not even just about the books either. It's about like, and we don't have to get on a Barnes and Noble soapbox, but like there are structures within publishing and how books are sold and how books find their ways into the hands of readers and how they're marketed that I think need to change. And so that's another frustrating thing. Like, you know, I didn't know as a teacher in a rural school that writers were writing rural stories, or that there were rural people who were writers, you know?
Right.
And so when I finally thought to ask the question, I Googled like rural YA books, and I got like 4 hits, and 2 of them were Jeff Zentner's The Serpent King, which is a fine book, you know?
Yeah.
But like if you search for like urban YA fiction, you're just flooded with results, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But there are still rural YA books that exist out there, but they don't get marketed that way because they think that people don't want to read rural stories. So if like rural places, like it's like incidental if it happens, if it takes place in a rural place, like it's like, oh, you know, like so I think that needs to change. I think there are a lot of things that need to change, but I just am grateful that there are writers who are, you know, out here working like you are to make sure that there are folks doing that work to make sure that, you know, stories.
Yeah. I think
get heard.
Yeah, I think that you know, I'm in community with so many amazing creators and so many amazing writers, and the body of work that exists, you know, it's growing, it's changing, and it is sometimes it feels like a very slow crawl, you know, but the work is being done, and you're right, you know, publishing and you know, I think needs to take more strides to supporting this work, and putting, you know, the marketing money and resources and the publicity resources behind these stories. You know, I think that's important and something that can definitely be improved upon. And I'm happy to see that more stories are getting that attention, are getting that kind of the support that they deserve. But it's definitely not easy. And kind of like you were saying with things like Barnes and Noble and the way that's being handled, you know, it pretty much ensures that new types of stories that feel new, stories that highlight maybe areas that haven't been highlighted before, it virtually ensures that young readers at Barnes and Noble will not be given access to those stories, which is extremely disheartening. I write for young people. I write for young readers. It's hard to know. It's hard to accept that, you know, I have this story and it's going to be out there, but, you know, maybe Barnes and Noble isn't going to carry it, and so, you know, maybe a young reader who, not everybody has an indie to go to. Sometimes Barnes and Noble is the store that you go to get books. Not everybody has their own kind of indie shop, but it's just with these types of changes that get made at this corporate level, because booksellers are great. Booksellers are amazing. They're so supportive, and they really do try to bend over backwards, in my experience, to support stories like mine. But these decisions that get made at this kind of corporate level, they have a really detrimental effect on the types of stories that will get told and because everybody knows, in order to get that paperback, you have to sell these hardcovers, and you have to kind of, you have to try to make a mark. And it's like, it just feels like another hurdle that we have to jump over. But because I am an optimist, the thing that gives me the most kind of hope is that there are still authors like myself and like many, many others who are out here, who are doing the work, who are disheartened by the lack of support, but who will not, I will not be dissuaded from doing this type of work, and for continuing to give my young readers a mirror, or a window, whatever they need. So that's kind of what keeps me going, this community of writers who is really determined to make sure that our young readers have as many stories as is humanly possible.
Yeah. And I just, sometimes I hate Twitter, but I'm actually kind of grateful for it now. Because I get to see, as a reader, if I wasn't on there, you don't know about things like that. You don't know about things that happen at the corporate level that are affecting the authors who are writing books that you want to read. All you know is that when you walk in, you see a table of books displayed in the middle of the, in the middle of the aisle, or on an end cap, or, whatever. And there's usually a classics one, and there's usually, there's usually a new releases one. And you can go peruse the shelves, but that's like all like, as a reader, I don't think we often think about like how the books get there, or what decisions are being made that sort of controls how the books get there.
Right.
So I'm just grateful that you and so many other people are talking about it, because I think there's then more avenues for like activism and protest,
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I want to be able to get access to this book, and if you're not going to carry it, then I'm not going to buy from you,
Right. And I think it's kind of shooting yourself in the foot. There is no bottom line without the product that we as creators create, and there's no bottom line without readers who go in to buy those products, those books. So it's kind of like, maybe don't do the thing that harms both the reader and the creator. Maybe don't do that. Maybe don't prioritize that. Maybe like think of how this looks and what it means, in a real practical type of way, which is why I'm saying it's kind of those decisions that get made at the corporate level by somebody who isn't on the floor every day, hand selling books, and so yeah, it's a struggle. It is a struggle, but we will continue to try to do the best we can to make sure that these books get into the hands of the readers who need them most.
Yeah. And that's what this site is all about. That's what this show is all about, making sure that rural teachers and rural readers know that these books exist and that they can go out and get them. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that. And I think that that's very similar to what's happening in education too, all these people who aren't in classrooms, who don't have interactions with students, who are only listening to a small minority of very loud parents, making decisions that are harmful for everyone.
Yeah. Again, it's with the recent spate of book banning and things like that. My first novel, Cinderella's Dead, was caught up in all of that, and it still is caught up in all of that. Again, it feels like we're fighting on so many different fronts. It can be exhausting, but again, at the end of the day, it's really just about the readers. It's really about who these stories are for, and so yeah, it's it's a lot. Like I just want to tell stories. I just want to tell stories, and and give people an escape, or give people something that resonates with them. That's all I want to do. I want to write. I want to sit in my office and write stories, and not have to like worry that somebody's going to ban my book, or that somebody's not going to carry my book in a store because it's not whatever kind of made up metric they have for deciding whether it's worthy. I just want to tell stories and have those stories get into the hands of the people who need them.
Whatever made up metric they come up with to make sure that white stories,
right, like the metric is is racism, is white supremacy, is just blatant homophobia. It's heteronormative societal expectations. It's all of these things, and none of those things really get mentioned in these articles and these pieces and these statements that get put out by the people in charge. It's
right,
it's
sanitized,
right, but let's be real. Like let's talk about what the real issue is.
That's what it is. It's hegemony. That's what it is. Yeah. Well, I am grateful that you are just still in it, still fighting. And that makes me think of Bree, and that makes me think of, like the fact that she was a fighter too. And it brings me to another question that I had, which I think connects to what you were talking about, like why you write these stories. I think it was in your acknowledgement in This Wicked Fate, you talk about how like you set out just to write a story, right? To write a story, a fun story about, a girl who, interacts with plants and, goes on these epic journeys and stuff. But what you ended up writing was a novel about healing generational trauma. And I think that is evident in both This Poison Heart and This Wicked Fate. And so I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about that, about how, like, as a writer, because I think especially the students in English classrooms and English teachers, when we talk about like sitting down to write something, it's always that like we know where we're going and we know what we're looking for and what we want to happen at the end of this writing thing. But I think what you demonstrated in that acknowledgement and with both of these books is that sometimes you don't know what you're actually writing. It's the act of writing that helps you discover what it is that you're actually wanting to say. And I think that's really important, especially in this age of standardized testing and sort of the really unhealthy way that we think about writing and what it should be. And so anyway, I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that sort of journey of discovery and how it's impacted you as a writer and the way that you maybe think about future projects.
Yeah. I think I have taken countless writing workshops and classes, and I have read all kinds of craft books, and I'm constantly trying to kind of tinker with my writing process, but it always ends up that where I start and where I thought I was going to end up, it never really works out that way. And I am a person who I like to plot, I like to plan, I love a good outline. I have this, this kind of involved process when it comes to writing, but I leave enough room because I know that there's a point in the story where things are kind of flowing and the ideas are kind of in your head and you're just writing, and the story will, for me, will literally tell me where it needs to go. It will literally say, like, we have to go here. This is where we're going. And my job is to follow that because I feel like there's something really really meaningful in the work that comes out of following those types of leads in the story. And it's always exciting to me. It's so fun to kind of think, oh, well, I thought I knew where this was going to go, but now there's this whole other world of possibility. That feels magical to me. Like, how do you write down, or do you sit down and you write these things down, and then your brain is just like, we're going somewhere else, and it works out? Like, I always, whenever I'm done with like a draft and it kind of makes sense, I'm like, how did I even like manage to do that? And I think it's a combination of just being an avid reader. It's a combination of writing so much, allowing myself to write things that aren't great so that I can learn. It's about constantly being open to change and to learning. And so I find the writing process to be one of discovery and of and it can be transformative for me as a person. And then also those stories that kind of resonate with me and make me feel like that tend to resonate with readers. And so so there's something very personal about the act of storytelling. And I still just feel completely in awe of the process, and I feel very fortunate to be able to do this work.
Yeah, Louise Rosenblatt talks about that relationship between, the author and the writer as a poem, right? The sort of meaning making that comes out of that relationship between the writer who wrote the words and the reader who's reading the words. And I think that's one of the most beautiful theoretical concepts
Mhm.
in literacy scholarship, is that that meaning is a poem. I love that so much. I don't have a good segue for this next question.
Okay.
And I feel like I touched on a lot of the things that I was going to ask in your other responses. And every writer that I have interviewed for this podcast has said that, like, you want to be a good writer, you got to read.
Yeah.
And so what do you like to read in terms of like novels? I mean, you talked about craft books and stuff like that, which I think are immensely helpful, but what sort of outside of craft books do you like to read, and how do you think that those influence the way that you write?
Yeah, I couldn't be a writer without being a reader. It's the reason that I started writing is because I was a reader first, and I really wanted to write stories that were like Nancy Drew novels. But I love scary stories. And I'm rereading The Only Good Indians right now, and I just finished The Fisherman by John Langan, and I also just finished The Grip of It by Jack Gems, which and I just finished reading My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I tend to kind of read in the genre that I'm writing. So I'm working on a lot of scary stuff right now, but maybe not necessarily the same age category. I'm writing horror for YA, but I'm reading a lot of adult horror. And I read widely. I read across genres and age categories. And I love horror, but I also love sci-fi. I'm a huge Michael Crichton fan. Like for real. I love reading a story where I get to the end and I'm like, I could totally like reverse engineer some dinosaur DNA, and I could totally do this. Like the process, it's so fascinating to me, and the way that that's told narratively is fascinating to me. I also love romance. I'm a huge fan of Beverly Jenkins. I love Gothic fiction. Like I said, I am an eclectic reader. I love books. I love storytelling. And to me, it just feels like such a magical thing. I read to escape. I read to feel seen. I read to scare myself sometimes, because that's a thing. I read, I read Seth Rogen's, like the thing he just did, and I forget the name of it, but I was dying. Love storytelling in general. And so it's really, for me, it's the foundation of my writing, all of that. And I'm constantly learning something new with every story that I pick up. I feel like I learn something about the craft of writing, about storytelling, about different ways to tell stories. I feel like every book that I read kind of adds to that knowledge base so that I can be a better writer.
Yeah. The Only Good Indian, was that Stephen Graham Jones?
Yes.
He also wrote My Heart is a Chainsaw, right?
Yes.
That one, My Heart is a Chainsaw, is like at the top of my TBR. Like I have a very long list, but Rob Costello actually So I was never really a horror reader. I liked horror movies when I was younger, but I sort of, got away from it and didn't really even think about YA horror as a thing. Even though every October as a teacher, I did like a spooky unit where I would allow students to like pick their own spooky book,
Mhm.
whether it was dark fantasy or, whatever. And so I let them read it, but I never read it with them. And so when I met Rob through Nora Shalloway Carpenter, we had got to talking. He watched my interview with Melissa Wyatt, I think, where we were talking about how like rural places just aren't very widely represented in YA fiction. He was like, actually, in rural horror,
Mhm.
in YA horror fiction, it's actually kind of overrepresented. Like there's find it there way more than you do anywhere else. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And it somewhat makes sense because of like the isolation, there's a lot of
Sure.
things that scare people about nature and about, rural places and people. And so that was really interesting. So we're sort of doing a project around, we presented at the YA Summit, but we're also still sort of thinking together still about like, how horror as a genre can help students think about place and about how identities interact with place. And anyway, so like it's a new landscape for me. It's something that I haven't really read a lot of, and
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it a lot actually. We included This Poison Heart in our presentation at YA Summit actually.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good work being done in the horror space. I think that it gets totally discounted sometimes just for not being serious or just being kind of campy or whatever. And it's just like and YA fantasy also gets a bad rap for that as well, as like not being a space to be able to do these things. But I'm just like, come on, have you read like any like recent like I think Legendborn by Tracy Dion, and I'm gonna laugh at myself because I every single time I do like an interview or so, I'm like, let's talk about Tracy, let's talk about Legendborn because I love it so much. But I think it is one of the most gripping portrayals of grief and dealing with grief, dealing with loss, that I have ever read in any genre, in any age category ever in my life. Like I really, it is that powerful, and that is a YA fantasy story. There is so much good work being done across genres, and I love scary stories. I think there's something kind of fundamental about fear, about feeling fear and dealing with it, and how that looks and how that changes how you move through the world. There's so much to be explored there. And yeah, so I'm all for it.
And like considering like what is there to be afraid of in certain spaces, maybe
Yes.
more so than others, and like how do we deal with that? So I read Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Caesar.
Mhm.
Like that's like if Scream and what was the other book that I said at the time? I can't remember, but I was like, this is like if Scream and this other horror film, It. It's like if Scream and
Mhm.
It had a baby, it would be this book. Um, but but I went into it with that attitude, right? That like horror doesn't have anything sophisticated or like critically serious to offer. But that book is like one of the most like gripping critiques and like visceral critiques of like our current stage, like late stage capitalism and
Mhm.
white supremacy, and sort of like the Trump presidency and all of that stuff,
Yeah.
like it is such a heavy critique of all of that stuff. And you wouldn't think that you would find that in a horror book, but he did an amazing job at making that part of the story. And so I'm like, okay, all right. So like
Yeah.
now this is a genre that I'm gonna go to just to see what's up and what people are doing. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it's totally underrated. I think that it's just seen as like, I don't know, and combined with YA, YA is already like, oh, that's a kiddie book, or whatever.
Right.
Obviously they deal with hard topics or they wouldn't be being banned
Right.
left and right across the country. But yeah, like it's not fluff. It's not fluff.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not.
and so I was really excited about that. And I was excited that that sort of led me to, because Rob's the first person who recommended this Poison Heart to me. And
Oh,
then
awesome. Yeah.
and then it was nominated for the Whippoorwill. And so then I read it as part of my work on that committee. And so it was just like the stars aligned. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm really grateful for that, because it's led me to a lot of really great stories and great things to think about. I mean, I was kind of curious about your research process for this Poison Heart, because of like, I was like super into Greek mythology. In my 8th grade English class, we like memorized the Greek alphabet, and we did this, like, I still haven't memorized, like Greek unit about, sort of the family tree of the gods and like all of this stuff. And so I was like super into that for a while. And so I was excited about that connection. And then also I was a farmer, and I'm not a botanist by any means, but like plants
Yeah.
were important to me and my family. And so like that, there are some really beautiful prints too, like lithograph prints of, I always thought those were so beautiful, of plants and plant anatomy and stuff like that. And so I was just kind of curious about like what your research process was like, because it just seems like you did like a ton of work.
I did. And I'm glad that it shows, because I really did. So I do not have a green thumb. I am the opposite of whatever a green thumb is. Like, I am terrible with plants, even though I really wish that I wasn't. I do try, but it just doesn't work out for me. And so, but I'm fascinated by plants and nature in general. I'm fascinated by the use of plants um, in folk magic, specifically African-based folk magic, um, uh, that was being practiced by people who lived in the South, the American South, and I wanted to lean into that. I wanted to lean into um, Briseis's kind of discovery. Briseis has this knowledge base that is very kind of like clinical about plants in the beginning. And she loves that, and that's great. But what she comes to find out is this other kind of personal connection that she has to plants and their uses. And that those two things together really kind of give her a better understanding of where she comes from and this power that she has. And so I did a ton of research to kind of cover that very clinical side of it. And then I also, just based on my personal knowledge from my own family, but also just kind of researching folk magic and folk magic uses of plants and herbs, I did a ton of research there. And I developed kind of this fascination with carnivorous plants, because I love musical theater. And so Little Shop of Horrors is one of my favorite musicals. And, you know, there's the Audrey too. And to me, that plant, that is like eating people, I'm just like, wait, what is, can I work that in here somehow? Is there a real life kind of parallel to this? And there are some really terrifying, some really terrifying plants that I came across. But that research process was just so much fun for me. But then also there's the Greek mythology piece of it. I was super fascinated by Greek mythology as a kid. I'm 38, and so I came up in a time like, Hercules, the Disney movie is like a super popular thing, and um, uh, I was just fascinated by that. But for this story, I really wanted to kind of clue in on, so obviously there's Medea because the musical theater background again, but I wanted to dig into some stories that were maybe not as well known as as Hercules and Zeus and all these kind of characters that we're super familiar with. And I wanted to think about how all of that might look when there's a Black family at the center of this story, because I think that's also something we don't see. If you are descended from gods and you've gone through hundreds and hundreds of generations, why could your family not be full of Black people right at this moment? It just doesn't make sense to me. So I wanted to explore that. I wanted to kind of bring all of these things together, and so the research there was pretty extensive because I knew that there would be pushback. I knew that there would be pushback against having Black people at the center of this story that talks about Greek mythology, and gods and goddesses and lineage and all of this. And so I had to really, I felt like I really had to dig into that research process just to even have a historical kind of grounding for some of these things. It's a fictional story. Like, I could have made up anything that I wanted to, but
Right.
but I think we all kind of understand that it doesn't always work that way for Black authors. There's kind of, there's this thought that Black people didn't exist in certain places or certain spaces, and it's just not true. And so I did all of this research, and I tried very hard to make sure that that was evident in the work so that I could minimize the amount of time that I had to like bring out my stack of papers and like show people like, well, this is what I did and this is why I said what I said. So I thankfully have found that that's been the case. Most people are taking from the work what I put into it, and it's the research process though was extensive, because I wanted to get it to feel as authentic as possible.
Yeah. Well, I was just blown away by it. Because there's just so much. There's just so
Yeah.
But I really loved the folk. I'm super into folk writing and folk history, and writing down oral histories. And in Appalachia there's a lot of, and when my grandma used to say things, I used to be like, what?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you got a wart here, honey. We're gonna tap it with this straw. We're gonna tap it with it, and it's,
Right.
I promise you,
Right. The overlap between different systems of folk magic is fascinating to me. There are so many like, you're gonna put this potato in your sock. Oh, you're sick, you're gonna put this potato in your sock, or this, or this onion in your sock, or you're gonna do this, you're gonna and then I'll meet other people who say, oh, well, we did something similar. It's like the overlap there is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I think there's so much in common with kind of these folk magic practices and regional folk magic practices. It's all very fascinating to
Get her
me.
name wrong. Yeah, the Ghosts
Um,
of Ordinary Objects series. There's a lot of folk magic in that, and it takes place in Appalachia, and so I started for the first time. Like, when I was reading that, I was like, oh, so like my grandma wasn't weird.
yeah.
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 This has some basis in culture. I
Yes.
thought she was weird.
Yeah.
Like, what is the science behind this, grandma? Like,
Right.
telling me to put a broom straw on my wart and it's gonna go away. Like,
Yeah.
where does that even come from? But at the same time, it, like, with the overlap, it makes you think that, like, because there are medicinal uses for these plants, like, it would make sense that, like, especially like regionally, if a plant was discovered, like ginseng, if you think about like how ginseng was like hunted and taken from the hills, especially in like mid Appalachia, like that's what my great grandpa did, like from the time that he was 8 years old, to help make money for the family, is hunt ginseng. And so those plants, right, actually do have medicinal properties. And so if that's discovered, and then like, it just sort of makes sense that there would be some overlap. But at the same time, it's like, these folks were really far apart.
Yeah.
Some of these practices, if they overlap in ways where it like doesn't make sense in terms of like the location of the people and how little transaction, like, among and across the people happened, it's like, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
That's another element of place that that I haven't really thought about a lot, and now I want to.
Yeah.
So thank you for giving me a new avenue of investigation. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, we are about at an hour, so I will just say thank you so much. This has been a lovely conversation, and I was like hoping against all hope, and like that you would have time to talk to me, and me and my little podcast here. So thank you for making time to do that. I really appreciate it, and I'm
Yeah,
gonna
of
keep my
course.
fingers crossed for a third book.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah, but thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and keep it a viable endeavor for me, it'd be great if you would like and comment on the YouTube episode. You could talk about what you liked most or what you walked away with. It'd also help if you'd subscribe to the channel. You can also head over to the Support Us page on the Literacy in Place website. There you can learn about all the different ways you can support this work, like you can like and follow the website itself, find out where to engage with us via social media, and go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Or you could shop our storefront on bookshop.org to get the book featured in this episode or any other books that catch your eye. You could also buy us a coffee at ko-fi.com and donate once or set up a recurring donation. All of this would be immensely helpful in keeping this show going. So thanks a bunch for doing what you can. Well, that's it for this episode. Until next time, y'all come back now, would ya?